They circled him like vultures, teenagers with designer shoes and cruel smirks. To them, he was just another bum shuffling past their school. But the man they'd knocked down, the photo they'd stepped on, he'd once led troops through firefights in Afghanistan. And 15 minutes later, the cop who showed up wasn't just any officer. She was one of the soldiers he had saved. When she recognized him, the sidewalk turned into sacred ground. If you believe sacrifice should never be stepped on, hit like, comment, respect, and subscribe, because this story proves the uniform may come off, but the honor never does. The cardboard wasn't much, but it kept the wind out. Thomas Martinez had built his shelter behind Murphy's hardware store 3 months ago, using skills he'd learned in Afghanistan, constructing forward operating bases from scraps and determination. The difference was, back then, he had a unit. Now, he had a shopping cart, 2 blankets, and a Purple Heart medal wrapped in a plastic bag. At 52, Thomas looked older. The streets had a way of aging a man faster than combat ever could. His beard was gray and unkempt, his army jacket faded but still bearing the faint outline of sergeant stripes. Most people walking by didn't notice the jacket. They saw the cardboard, the dirt, the defeat, and kept walking. Thomas didn't blame them. He'd done the same thing once. Every morning, he folded his blankets with military precision, stacked the cardboard neatly, and walked 6 blocks to the VA clinic. Not for treatment. He'd given up on that paperwork maze months ago, but because they had a bathroom where he could wash his face and hands. Clean water, soap, and for 5 minutes, dignity. The route took him past Lincoln High School, where teenagers gathered before first period, laughing, texting, alive with the kind of energy that came from knowing you had somewhere to go. Thomas kept his head down, walked quietly, tried not to exist too loudly in their world. But today was different. Today, one of them noticed him. "Yo, check out the hobo," Derek laughed, elbowing his friend Tyler. "Dude smells like a dumpster from here." Tyler, 17 and built like he'd never missed a meal, looked up from his phone. "Gross. Why don't they just get jobs?" A small crowd gathered, 6 teenagers, all designer clothes and expensive sneakers, forming a loose circle around Thomas as he tried to continue walking. Their leader, Derek, stepped directly into his path. "Excuse me, sir," Derek said with mock politeness. "This is a school zone. Don't you think you should find somewhere else to exist?" Thomas stopped. His eyes met Derek's for just a moment, and the boy saw something there that made him uncomfortable. Not fear, not anger, but a kind of tired recognition. Like Thomas had seen this before, in worse places, with higher stakes. "I'm just walking to the clinic," Thomas said quietly. "I'll be out of your way in a minute." "Clinic?" Another boy, Kevin, laughed. "What, they have a special place for losers now?" The group circled tighter. Thomas felt it. The shift in energy, the way young men moved when they smelled weakness. He'd seen it in village raids, in bar fights, in the kinds of places where violence started as entertainment and ended in blood. "Please," Thomas said, his voice steady but tired. "I don't want any trouble." But trouble had already found him. Derek shoved him, not hard, just enough to make Thomas stumble backward, his cart rattling on the uneven sidewalk. The contents, a few cans of food, a worn Bible, a faded photograph of his unit, shifted and clinked together. "Oops," Derek grinned. "Didn't see you there." Thomas straightened slowly, his hands raised peacefully. "Look, I'm a veteran. I served this country. I'm not looking for—" "Veteran," Tyler cut him off. "Of what? The war on soap?" The laughter was sharp, cruel. More students had gathered now, phones out, recording. Thomas saw the cameras and felt something die inside him. Not his pride, that had been gone for months, but the last small hope that maybe, someday, he might walk down this street without being a spectacle. "Army," Thomas said quietly. 2 tours in Afghanistan. I just need to get to the clinic." Kevin stepped forward, chest puffed out. "My dad says homeless people are just lazy, says they choose to live like animals." "I didn't choose this," Thomas replied, his voice beginning to crack. "I came home and things fell apart. Lost my job, lost my apartment, lost your mind, looks like," Derek interrupted. Then he shoved again, harder this time. Thomas hit the ground, his palms scraping against the concrete. His cart tipped over, spilling its meager contents across the sidewalk. The photograph of his unit fluttered in the wind, and he reached for it desperately. That's when Derek stepped on his hand. "Don't touch that trash," Derek said, grinding his heel down. "That's probably covered in diseases." Thomas cried out, not from the pain, but from the sight of his boot pressing down on the faces of his fallen brothers. Men who'd died for the freedom these kids took for granted. Men who'd never made it home to be beaten on a sidewalk by children who didn't know the cost of their comfort. He tried to pull his hand free, and Derek kicked him in the ribs. The blow knocked the wind out of him, and he curled up instinctively, protecting his vital organs the way he'd been trained. "Fight back, old man," Tyler laughed, kicking him again. "Come on, show us those army moves." But Thomas couldn't fight back. Not against children, not when he knew what real violence looked like, what it cost, what it took from a man's soul. He covered his head with his arms and endured. The kicks came from all sides now. Not hard enough to seriously injure, but enough to hurt, to humiliate, to break whatever was left of his spirit. His ribs ached, his back screamed, and something warm trickled from his nose. Through it all he could hear the laughter, the phones recording, the casual cruelty of people who had never known real hardship. He thought of his unit, of the men who died believing they were protecting something worth dying for. Maybe they'd been wrong. Officer Maria Santos was 3 blocks away when the call came in. "Disturbance at Lincoln High, possible assault in progress." She'd been patrolling this beat for 8 years, knew every corner, every regular, every problem that cropped up on her watch. She also knew Thomas Martinez, not personally, not yet. But she'd seen him around, always respectful, always quiet, always trying to be invisible. She'd run his name through the system once, curious, and found a record that made her heart heavy. Army Sergeant, 2 Purple Hearts. Honorable discharge, and then a slow descent into the statistics that nobody wanted to talk about. 22 veterans a day, that's what the report said. 22 a day chose to stop fighting the war that never ended in their heads. Maria had been Air Force, served in Iraq, came home to a country that thanked her for her service, but didn't know what to do with her afterward. She'd been lucky, found purpose in the badge, in protecting the same communities she'd served overseas. But she knew how thin that line was, how easily it could have been her under that cardboard instead of Thomas. She rounded the corner and saw the crowd, teenagers in a circle, phones up, the excitement of a pack that had found prey. In the center, a man on the ground, arms over his head, taking kicks like rain. Maria's hand moved to her radio. "This is Unit 47. I need backup at Lincoln High School. We have an assault in progress." Then she saw the victim's face, and her blood ran cold. She knew that face, not from the streets, not from previous calls, but from a photograph that sat on her desk at home. A unit photo taken in Baghdad, 2009, 3rd row. Second from the left, Sergeant Thomas Martinez, her squad leader, the man who'd pulled her out of a burning Humvee when she was just a scared kid with a rifle, the man who'd written her recommendation letter for the police academy, the man who'd saved her life and never asked for anything in return. Now he was on the ground, being beaten by children who didn't know they were kicking a hero. Maria's vision went red. She'd seen combat, had been trained to control her emotions, to think tactically. But watching Thomas, her Thomas, being brutalized by a pack of kids who'd never known sacrifice, triggered something primal in her. She hit the siren, one sharp burst that scattered the crowd like startled birds. Students ran in all directions, but Maria was already out of the car, her hand on her service weapon, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been trained to command respect. "Everybody stop where you are!" The teenagers froze. Some dropped their phones. Others tried to blend into the crowd. But Derek, still drunk on adrenaline and pack mentality, stepped forward. "Officer, this guy was harassing students. We were just—" "Shut up," Maria said, her voice cold as winter. "Not another word." She knelt beside Thomas, who was still curled up, still protecting himself from blows that were no longer coming. His face was bruised, his lips split, but his eyes were the worst part. Empty, defeated, like he'd finally accepted that this was all he was worth. "Thomas," she said softly, "it's me. It's Maria." He looked up slowly, recognition dawning in his eyes. Santos? Little Santos from the 442nd? Not so little anymore, she said, helping him sit up. Are you hurt? Do you need medical attention? He shook his head, more from shame than honesty. I'm fine, I'm fine. But he wasn't fine. None of this was fine. Maria stood slowly, her hand still on her weapon. Her backup hadn't arrived yet, but she didn't need backup for this. She'd faced down insurgents with RPGs. A bunch of suburban teenagers wasn't going to be a problem. Which one of you touched him? She asked, her voice carrying across the now silent crowd. Nobody answered. They were all looking at their phones, at the ground, anywhere but at her. I said, which one of you put your hands on this man? Derek tried to swagger forward, but his confidence was evaporating under Maria's stare. Look, officer, we didn't know he was important or whatever. He was just some homeless guy causing problems. Some homeless guy? Maria's voice was deadly quiet. You mean Sergeant Thomas Martinez, recipient of 2 Purple Hearts, Bronze Star, and Combat Infantry Badge? You mean the man who spent 18 months fighting for your freedom while you were still learning to tie your shoes? The crowd was silent now. Even the teachers who'd come out to see what was happening stood still, processing what they'd just heard. Turn around, Maria said to Derek. Hands behind your back. What? You can't arrest me for assault on a disabled veteran, Maria said, pulling out her handcuffs. Public disturbance, destruction of property. She gestured to Thomas's scattered belongings. Should I keep going? Tyler stepped forward. This is bullshit. Our parents are lawyers. You can't just... Your parents are lawyers? Maria smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. Good. They're going to need them. She cuffed Derek first, then Tyler, then Kevin. The others in the crowd started to back away, but Maria's voice stopped them. Nobody leaves. You all stood there and watched this happen. You all recorded it. You're all part of this. 2 more patrol cars arrived, followed by an ambulance. Mariah had called for medical attention for Thomas, but she also had another plan forming. She keyed her radio to a specific frequency, one that connected her to the precinct's Special Operations Unit. This is Santos. I need to speak to Captain Rodriguez. Tell him it's about the Martinez situation. Captain Rodriguez was a legend in the department, 25 years on the force, former Marine, the kind of cop who commanded respect from both his officers and the streets. He was also a veteran, someone who understood what it meant to serve and to be forgotten. Within minutes, his unmarked car pulled up. Rodriguez stepped out, took one look at Thomas sitting on the curb, and his expression hardened. Santos, report. 6 juveniles assaulted a homeless veteran, sir. The victim is Sergeant Thomas Martinez, Army, 2 tours Afghanistan. He's been living on the streets for approximately 3 months. Rodriguez knelt beside Thomas, his voice gentle. Sergeant, I'm Captain Rodriguez, former Marine. Can you tell me what happened? Thomas looked up, saw the bearing, the recognition in the captain's eyes. I was just walking to the clinic. They said things. Then it got physical. They put their hands on you? Yes, sir. Rodriguez stood slowly, his jaw tight. He walked over to the 3 teenagers in handcuffs, studied their faces like he was memorizing them. You boys like picking on veterans? Derek, still defiant, shrugged. We didn't know... You didn't know what? That he was a human being? That he deserved respect? Rodriguez's voice was controlled, but everyone could hear the rage underneath. You think being homeless makes someone less than you? Look, our parents will be very disappointed, Rodriguez finished. Santos, I want these 3 charged with assault, hate crimes, and anything else that'll stick. And I want them processed downtown, not juvenile. If they're old enough to beat a veteran, they're old enough to face adult consequences. What happened next would become the stuff of legend in the precinct. Captain Rodriguez didn't just process the arrests, he launched a full investigation. Within hours, detectives were interviewing witnesses, collecting phone footage, building a case that would make national news. The videos were damning. Clear footage of the assault, of the teenagers laughing while Thomas was on the ground, of the complete lack of empathy from the crowd. Social media had been their weapon, and now it became their undoing. But Rodriguez wasn't done. He made calls, pulled strings, contacted people who owed him favors. By evening, the local news was running the story. By morning, it was national. By the end of the week, it was international. Homeless veteran beaten by teens became a rallying cry. The footage went viral, not for entertainment, but for outrage. People who'd never thought twice about homelessness suddenly saw Thomas's face and remembered their own fathers, their own brothers, their own sons who'd served. The school district launched its own investigation. The parents of the arrested teenagers found themselves facing not just criminal charges, but civil suits, public shame, and the kind of scrutiny that comes when you raise children who think beating veterans is entertainment. Meanwhile, Thomas found himself in a hospital bed, being treated not just for his injuries, but for the conditions that had led to his homelessness. Rodriguez had made sure he was admitted, made sure he had insurance coverage, made sure he wasn't forgotten again. "You don't have to do this," Thomas told Rodriguez during one of his visits. "Yes, I do," Rodriguez replied. "We all do. We failed you once. We're not going to fail you again." The story that emerged during the investigation was all too familiar. Thomas had returned from Afghanistan with PTSD, traumatic brain injury, and a service-connected disability. The VA had been overwhelmed, understaffed, slow to respond to his needs. His marriage had collapsed under the strain. His job at a construction company had ended when his injuries made physical labor impossible. The descent had been gradual, then sudden. Savings depleted, friends exhausted, family estranged. The system that was supposed to catch him had let him fall through the cracks, and he'd been falling for 2 years before hitting the streets. But the beating had done something unexpected. It had made him visible. Suddenly, everyone wanted to help the homeless veteran. Donations poured in, job offers arrived, housing assistance appeared. The same community that had ignored him for months now couldn't do enough for him. Thomas was grateful, but also confused. "Why now?" he asked Rodriguez. "Why does it take getting beaten for people to care?" Rodriguez didn't have a good answer. He'd been asking himself the same question. The 3 teenagers were eventually convicted of assault and sentenced to community service, specifically 200 hours each at the local VA hospital. They would spend their weekends for the next year learning about the people they'd dismissed as worthless. Derek's father, a prominent lawyer, tried to get the charges reduced. "Boys will be boys," he argued. "They made a mistake." Rodriguez's response was swift and public. "If this is how your boy behaves, then you failed as a father. These men didn't make a mistake. They made a choice, and choices have consequences." 6 months later, Thomas was living in a 1-bedroom apartment across town, working part-time at a nonprofit that helped other veterans transition back to civilian life. His beard was trimmed, his clothes were clean, but his eyes still carried the weight of everything he'd seen and survived. The apartment was sparse but clean. A bed, a table, a chair, and on the wall, a framed photograph of his unit. The same photograph that had been scattered on the sidewalk that day, now preserved behind glass. He'd been invited to speak at schools, to share his story with kids who might otherwise grow up to be the kind of people who thought beating homeless veterans was acceptable. The message was simple. Everyone has a story. Everyone deserves dignity. And the uniform doesn't make the man. The man makes the uniform. At Lincoln High School, where it all started, Thomas spoke to an assembly of students. Many of them had been there that day, had watched, had recorded, had done nothing. Now they listened as he told them about Afghanistan, about losing friends, about coming home to a country that didn't know what to do with its broken warriors. "I'm not asking for pity," he said. "I'm asking for understanding. The next time you see someone on the streets, remember that they're somebody's son, somebody's father, somebody's brother. They have a story, and that story matters." When he finished, the auditorium was silent. Then, slowly, a girl in the front row stood up. Then another student, then another. Within moments, the entire school was on their feet, clapping not just for Thomas, but for the lesson he'd taught them about humanity. Derek, Tyler, and Kevin were in the audience, required to attend as part of their community service. They didn't clap, but they listened. And maybe, just maybe, they learned something. A year later, Lincoln High School installed a memorial garden dedicated to local veterans. At its center stood a bronze plaque with a simple inscription: "To those who served, who serve, and who will serve, your sacrifice is not forgotten." Thomas attended the dedication ceremony, not as a homeless man or a victim, but as a veteran, a survivor, a teacher. He stood beside Captain Rodriguez, Officer Santos, and dozens of other veterans who'd served, who'd come home, who'd found their way back to purpose. The garden became a place of reflection, a reminder that heroism doesn't always wear a uniform, that dignity doesn't depend on circumstances, and that a community's strength is measured by how it treats its most vulnerable members. Thomas still struggled some days. The PTSD didn't go away, the memories didn't fade, and the system that had failed him still had cracks. But he was no longer invisible. He had a voice, a purpose, and a community that had learned to see him. In the end, that's what mattered. Not the beating, not the arrests, not the national attention, but the moment when people stopped looking through him and started looking at him. The moment when a homeless veteran became a human being again. And in a small corner of one American city, that was enough to change everything. The streets still had their forgotten, their overlooked, their discarded. But now there were people watching, people caring, people remembering that everyone who falls deserves a chance to stand up again. Thomas Martinez had stood up. And in doing so, he'd helped a community stand up too. If you believe every veteran deserves dignity, every person deserves respect, and every community deserves to be better than its worst moment, then this story matters. Because the next time you see someone who's fallen, you'll remember that they're not just a statistic or a problem to be solved, they're a person. And that person might just be a hero who's forgotten how to be one, until someone reminds them.